Hi, this is Amanda Dery, AF Dery, and I am talking today about the Conquest of Calamere series and the first book about it, Winter's Fallen. Um, if you go online and check it out, the typography has changed on the cover, as with Broken Mirrors, but you'll recognize it, don't worry. And the contents are the same. So Winter's Fallen. Okay, it's the first book in the Conquest of Calamere series, which is a fantasy series that follows several different people. The first three books, beginning with Winter's Fallen, including Cast in Stone and Lord of War, each follow a different hero and heroine as the story advances. And then the last three books follow the same two main characters and introduces some new characters as well, and dovetails with some of the events at the end of Broken Lords. It's not necessary to read Broken Mirrors and Broken Lords before reading the Conquest of Calamere series. However, you will inevitably read spoilers for how that series ends if you read the Conquest of Calamere first. So my recommendation is to read them in this order: Winter's Fallen, Cast in Stone, Lord of War. Then if you're interested in reading short fiction at all, that would be a good time to read Breath of Life, which is not technically part of the series. It is standalone, but it provides backstory for one of the main characters in book 4, 5, and 6, Bound in Blood. And then before you read the next book, book 5, which is Forged in Spirit, I recommend reading Broken Mirrors and Broken Lords, and you will understand why when you then go back and read Forged in Spirit and the final book, The Beast of Lantara. So I know it sounds a little confusing, but basically I wrote it with the expectation that people would read Broken Mirrors books first. I knew those characters would be coming back, and that the two, they all these books take place in the same world, and I knew that the stories would dovetail at some point, but yeah. So that's my recommendation for the order to read them in. If you've never read me before, a good book to start with is indeed Winter's Fallen, because it is now and for the foreseeable future free on all my sales channels, and the information for where to find it will be down in the description as usual. So it's a way to read a full-length novel for free, at least in ebook form. If you want a paperback, then yeah, that's going to cost you. And that can be found on Amazon as well. But yeah, it's a good one to start with because it's free and it's full length, and I know not everyone is really into short fiction, so I never write my novellas to be, mandatory reading in order to understand a book, later on, because, short fiction is one of those things, you either like it or you don't. And if you don't, I don't feel like you should be obligated to have to, force yourself to sit down and read something that you ordinarily wouldn't read just so that you get what happens in a book that you bought. Let's not do that. So, yeah. So about Winter's Fallen specifically, the copy from the back here says, Grace has survived all of her life by simply doing her duty and not standing out, like all the people of her village, until the day their ruling warlord decides to claim her as the season's tax. In a moment of blind panic, she flees straight into the first storm of winter and into the life of a mysterious recluse. Now stranded in his tower until the spring thaw, she finds more than her mere freedom in peril, as no one and nothing is as it seems. Now, my thinking when I wrote Winter's Fallen was that I was a huge fan of Gothic romance along the lines of Victoria Holt when I was growing up, when I was like in high school. And I really wanted to try my hand at writing it, but at the same time, fantasy is totally my jam. and I'm not really big on ghosts and supernatural of that element in my writing. So I thought to myself that Winter's Fallen, that the plot of Winter's Fallen came to me, and I thought, that'd be a perfect way to explore this, gothic romance with a fantasy twist. And judging from the feedback I received after it went out, some people got it. Other people were just really disappointed that it wasn't exactly like Broken Mirrors and Broken Lords. They were expecting it to be more in that vein, and it was very different. Other people just plain didn't like it, which always happens with everything, and still other people thought it was better than Broken Mirrors, and they enjoyed it more than that, probably because it's a little bit more like what mainstream romantic fantasy is like right now. But I can't say where you'll fall on the spectrum. All I can say is, there's no risk involved. It's free. Pick it up, try it out. I did write the second book in the Conquest of Calamere series as more of a conventional fantasy. I dropped the gothic element you see in Winter's Fallen completely for the remainder of the series. So if you do read it and you think to yourself, well, it was okay, but, this whole trapped in a tower thing really isn't my speed, it's okay, all right? None of the other books are like that. And I wrote the second book, Cast in Stone, specifically to be an alternate entry point into the series for people who weren't interested in the premise of this first book. It picks up the overall plot and it catches you up, and you don't have to worry if you didn't finish the first one or just had no interest in it. You can pick it up from there, and it's fine. Okay. The last thing that I, as an author, ever want to do is disappoint my readers, let them down. And unfortunately, anytime you try something new, there's a risk that you're letting down people who liked the old stuff. And, well, what was wrong with it? Why are you changing things now? And I understand that, because I felt that way about some of my own favorite authors when they've tried their hand at different genres, or if they wrote a series with, a couple characters that, I just fell in love with, and then they start writing about different people, and I'm like, why? I like what you wrote before. But as a writer myself, I do understand it, because it's fun to write different things, and experiments may not always work out, but in terms of popularity, but you learn from them. I learned from writing this book and from the feedback I got on it. Winter's Fallen is really responsible for a lot of my maturation as an author. It was a good experience to have, and it'll always have a place in my heart for that reason, and I hope you all give it a shot. So, without further ado, I'm just going to read a short excerpt from the first chapter. I'm not going to read the whole first chapter, because my books are fairly long. As you see, I'm like 8 minutes into this video, and I haven't even gotten to the reading part yet. I'm long-winded in person and in my writing. I talk a lot, and I write a lot, and it's long, and I'm not going to read the whole first chapter. I will read an excerpt for you today, and of course you can pick up your own free copy. Links are in the description, and see for yourself if this is something that you would enjoy. And I really hope you'll give it a shot. What do you got to lose? Okay, so chapter 1. Autumn was nearly over, and it was time for the flock to be thinned. Grace watched from her lonely place standing in the midst of the open field as one by one the maidens of Havor formed rows all around her by the unseen dividing line between the land of their fathers and that of their father's enemy. That enemy was not some nebulous idea, some abstract they would never see. He was a great hulking man with cold dark eyes who came at the end of each autumn to collect his tax from among them. The land of Havor produced nothing else of any worth to the warlord, who could find all else he required elsewhere, and it could be argued that she produced nothing of any real worth at all, making this tax a mere token display of his rule over them. Grace herself, shivering alongside them, and the last of her sisters, both older and younger, to have to do so, was but one shining example. In the bitter cold of the last days of autumn, their breath fogging the air, these other young women, some just barely of the age to be called such, looked to her just like her father's sheep, bland and mild, as they trotted sedately to their expected places, some of the younger ones huddling closer to the older ones for warmth. She knew she looked no different from any of them in any respect save one. Their eyes were wide and frightened, like lambs before the shears for the first time. But this was not Grace's first time, and her own eyes were dull and resigned. This was her 5th year joining them in the field, and in 5 years she had never attracted any notice, not that of the unwed men of her village, and certainly not that of any enemy warlords. Of middling size and pale of skin, hair, and eyes, she was just another nondescript sheep in the flock, distinguishing herself only in that she was not distinguishable at all. Indeed, she attracted no notice even from her own family, among whom she moved like some colorless spirit, industrious and silent. Only her absence would be likely to be of any note, and with the way her life had been going so far, none of them would have expected such an occurrence any time soon, had any of them really thought about it at all. The wind was howling around the young women now, growing fiercer, the sky dark despite the fact that it was just shy of midday. Grace knew the signs of an impending storm and could taste the snow yet unfallen in the bite of the air. She was wrapped in her heaviest cloak, a rather sorry affair of much patched wool, and she wished fervently that the enemy would appear, make his choice, and have it over with. The thing she feared most was not the warlord or even the cold. It was watching one of the girls she had grown up with being taken away, never to return. No one spoke of what happened to the girls when the warlord hauled them away, but there wasn't a maiden in that field who had any doubts about their fate. But the tax was one maiden at the end of each autumn, and in exchange the warlord left them alone and extended his protection over them from those others who would claim Havor and her questionable produce out of mere spite. The maidens of Havor had been taught their duty for 2 decades now, slowly bleeding into a third. The warlord was beginning to show signs of graying, but no one dared hope he might not show up. If he did, another would just come to take his place, and that one might demand far more and far worse than just one virgin a year. It was really a pitiful tax compared to what some of Havor's neighbors endured. In many ways, Grace thought as her eyes scanned the tree line, it was good to be invisible and unnoticed. It was certainly safer. No sooner had the thought come and passed than the warlord came riding into the field on his large white horse, accompanied by a small retinue. It's a different horse this year, Grace thought irrelevantly as she rubbed her hands together briskly for warmth, eyeing the unusual gray dappling on the beast. She quickly stuffed her hands back under her cloak. She did not dare trust her usual invisibility under the circumstances. Keeping her head down had yet to fail her, and so she kept her eyes fixed on the wind-whipped browning grass before her feet. She heard the movement of the horses and the clinking of the warlord's armor as he dismounted, listened with something akin to boredom to his usual bellowed speech, reminding them of all his many benefits and tender mercies to Havor throughout the preceding year that he deemed, perhaps not inaccurately, as being more than worthy of his required tax. And then he began, at last, Grace sighed interiorly, to walk among them between the rows. Occasionally he paused to inspect a maiden more closely, to jerk aside a cloak, to look into a mouth, to leer, to paw at a bosom or behind, but it was cold, and the wind was picking up. He wasn't taking as long, walking among them as usual. Mere minutes had passed since he'd begun his inspection, and already he was walking down Grace's row, roughly in the middle of the gathered flock. She listened tiredly as his armor clung closer and closer. He paused not far off from her, something that would have sped her pulse and anxiety in years previous. This year she just felt numb, the wind biting through her cloak as though it were like her, barely there at all. The noise resumed, and moments later shining silver had planted itself in Grace's line of vision, and it did not move on. Startled by the incongruity from her usual experience, she looked up before she could stop herself, meeting the cold, dark eyes. This close, he was standing so close she could have touched him without fully extending her arms. His eyes, though just as dark, did not look so cold and menacing as they had from a distance. They looked weary, even bored. She saw her own expression of moments before twinned in them and almost gasped at the recognition. The warlord stared back at her unblinking, his graying brow furrowing slightly, and she felt her chest tighten and her throat close, the fear of 5 autumns flooding back into her all at once. Though he made no move to touch her or open her cloak, she felt naked and small under his unblinking gaze, utterly exposed, as though she were the only one in the field rather than one of many. She felt frozen to the spot, unable to even blink her own eyes, her mind completely blank. After a long moment of this, he made a motion with his right hand, still not looking away from her, and her gaze flickered involuntarily to his hand, staring at it without comprehension. "This one," was all he said. And then he reached for her. She was shocked beyond speech when his gauntleted hand closed around her upper arm, paralyzed as she mutely shook her head, her eyes returning to his, but he had already looked back to his horse and was already hauling her away. Her eyes fell on the wide-eyed gaze of one of the other maidens, a girl Grace had grown up with as neighbors. The girl, standing motionless with her hands covering her mouth, looked as shocked and horrified as Grace felt. The warlord pulled her along in her stupor as though she were indeed made of nothing. She scarcely knew if her feet were actually even touching the ground. 100 thoughts suddenly filled the blank that her mind had become, and each seemed to be competing loudly for attention in her head, at least half of them lurid images of what was about to happen to her, and the other half cries of denial and disbelief. She couldn't draw breath even to scream or cry. Spots swam before her eyes. An eternity could have passed in those moments it took to march her to his horse, and then she was half standing there, held up most of the way by her captor. He pushed her towards one of his men, who had dismounted unnoticed by Grace at some point in the proceedings, no doubt so he could take her up on his horse. In that brief moment of liberation, Grace had only one thought, one instinct, breaking like a clarion call through the fog of panic that had enveloped her. Run. She hardly knew what she was doing before she had made it to the tree line. Her behavior had no doubt shocked the man who had been supposed to grab her, and shocked the warlord who was unaccustomed to any kind of resistance from the sheep in the field. All she knew was that she was running. Fat flakes of white had begun to fall from the sky, stinging her eyes and skin. Blindly she ran, barely evading the trees as they grew together more densely, sometimes not evading them entirely. She thought she imagined footfalls behind her, but she couldn't be sure over the roaring of blood in her ears. Bare branches slapped at her face like a reprisal, tearing her skin. Her blood felt hot against the numbness, streaking across her skin, and still she ran. As the ground began to slope upward, her legs began to burn as much as her lungs. If it had been hard to breathe before, she could barely catch her breath at all now. She slumped behind one of the trees, gasping and panting, her heart pounding, feeling absolutely certain a hand would descend and grab her at any moment. She shut her eyes as tightly as she could against the falling snow and the vicious wind, aware for the first time of the salt in her eyes, the tears leaking down her numb face and mingling with the blood from her cuts, freezing against her skin. All at once the reality of what she had just done struck her. It was stupid, ridiculous, insane, shameful. She would never be able to outrun them. She was failing her duty, her family, her village. She was the worst of cowards, the lowest of the lowly. Who knew what the consequences would be to the very people who had accepted and raised her and known her all of her life? She was selfish, foolish, and just the time she had been running all manner of evil could have occurred because of her moment of insanity. Grace forced herself to open her eyes, to look tentatively around, but to her surprise she saw no one. Her pursuers must not have caught up with her yet. Or perhaps the warlord had chosen to let her go rather than pursue her at all and punish her village somehow instead. Again her breath hitched in her throat. A fresh wave of tears and remorse came over her. She forced herself to her feet on shaking legs and swiped an arm over her face. The snow was falling thicker and faster, and she was suddenly aware that she had no idea where she was. It was also much darker than it had been when she had begun. She started at that realization, wondering just how long she had been running. Surely it could not have been long. She looked around, desperately trying to regain her bearings, but nothing was familiar, and she wasn't even certain just where it was she had entered the tree line. It was entirely possible, perhaps even probable, that she was not even on the Havor side of the forest any longer. I have to get back. I have to get back and give myself over. I can't have been gone long. Perhaps just killing me will appease him, Grace thought desperately. She made her way back through the falling snow and trees, clutching her cloak more tightly around her, trying to retrace her steps, but her flight had truly been blind, and the snow had already covered her footprints. She had no idea where she was, or if she was even returning the same way she had come, or if she was wandering in aimless circles. Soon the snow was falling so hard she could not see farther than her hand in front of her face, and she was so cold she could not feel her face, or hands, or feet. She could not even hear the clicking of her teeth as they chattered against each other over the howling of the wind. It whipped in her hair, which had come unbound at some point when she had been running, and lashed at her clothing with greedy, ice-cold claws. Then she saw something moving by one of the trees. Her relief nearly matched her previous panic. It was surely one of the warlord's retinue hunting her. She tried to call out to him, but she could barely even hear herself over the howling wind. She tried to make her way towards it, and it was only when she was within arm's reach that she realized the shape she saw was no man at all. It was a wolf, large and gray, barely visible even up close amid the snow, and it was not the wind that was howling. It ceased its noise and lowered its head, staring at her with fathomless eyes. She screamed, or whatever thin sound could pass for it, as she staggered backward, falling over an exposed tree root onto her back. She scrabbled away backwards, staring at what she could see of the wolf as she tried wildly to get to her feet, but she could feel nothing, and it was impossible to get her feet back under her. The spots returned before her eyes, but this time they were crowding out everything else. She tried to push herself upwards with her hands, but they were numb, and quickly lost purchase with the slick, snow-covered ground, sending her falling backward again. Her head hit the ground hard, and all went dark as new howling filled her ears. And that is the first scene from the first chapter of Winter's Fallen by A.F. Dery. Once again, the information for how to pick up your own free copy is in the description of this video. And if you have any questions about it, or about the series at all, feel free to hit me up in the comments, and please be patient, but I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. I think that's it for this one. Thank you so much for your time and for your interest. I really appreciate it. You can check out more about any of my books on my publisher site, which is ringdroppress.com. We also have a Facebook page, which sometimes features teasers of upcoming books and other information. We're planning on doing some fun stuff in the months to come, so please do like us and, and get in on that. Thank you again.